The cigarette smoke drifted slowly across the Warner Brothers soundstage. Clint Eastwood, 38 years old and carrying the confidence of a man who had just redefined the American Western in 3 Italian films, stood 15 feet from John Wayne with the kind of quiet intensity that made veteran actors nervous. Across from him, the Duke himself, 63 and embodying 4 decades of Hollywood authority, watched this younger challenger with the careful attention of someone who had built an empire on knowing exactly where he stood in every room he entered. What happened in the next 4 minutes would shatter Wayne's certainty about who deserved respect in Hollywood and why the most dangerous mistake he could make was assuming that silence meant submission. This is the untold story of the moment when the man with no name forced the Duke to recognize that the future of American cinema had arrived without asking for permission, and that sometimes the most devastating challenges come from people who never raise their voices to deliver them. March 1971. The old guard of Hollywood was fighting for survival against a new generation that refused to follow the established rules. John Wayne represented everything traditional about American filmmaking: clear heroes, obvious villains, patriotic values, and the kind of larger-than-life performances that had defined cinema for generations. Clint Eastwood represented something that terrified the establishment: moral ambiguity, minimalist acting, European influences, and characters who won by being harder and quieter than everyone else. When these two forces met on a soundstage during the American Film Institute's tribute preparations, nobody expected what would follow. But something happened that afternoon that changed John Wayne's tone completely. Something that made him rethink everything he believed about talent, respect, and the changing nature of American heroism. And by the time Clint Eastwood walked away, the Duke would never speak about the next generation of actors the same way again. Stick around to find out what really happened between these two legends, and let us know in the comments where you're watching this from today. Spring 1971 at Warner Brothers Studios represented more than just another production season in Hollywood. The entire industry was experiencing a cultural earthquake. The studio system that had controlled American filmmaking for half a century was collapsing. Films like Easy Rider, Bonnie and Clyde, and The Wild Bunch had proven that audiences wanted something grittier, more complex, and more honest than the traditional heroic narratives that had dominated screens since the silent era. The old guard saw this as the death of everything they had built. The new generation saw it as long overdue evolution. On this particular March afternoon, 5 of Hollywood's most powerful traditional voices had gathered in Soundstage 12 for what was supposed to be a planning meeting for an upcoming American Film Institute event honoring classic Western films. John Wayne, whose presence alone could greenlight a project or end a career. Frank McCarthy, the legendary producer who had brought Patton to life and understood military precision in filmmaking. Richard Boone, a television Western icon whose Paladin character had defined sophisticated frontier justice for millions. Robert Mitchum, whose 40-year career spanned everything from film noir to epic adventures, always with that trademark world-weary charisma. And Howard Hawks, the director who had shaped Wayne's greatest performances and understood the architecture of American heroism better than almost anyone alive. These were men who had created the mythology of the American West on screen. They had fought real wars, built real careers through decades of dedicated work, and earned their authority through proven excellence. They approached filmmaking with the same values they approached life: honor, clarity, traditional masculinity, and unwavering commitment to American ideals. They practiced their craft with systematic dedication, studied the masters who came before them, and maintained standards that separated genuine artists from temporary trends. Which is exactly why they were so unsettled when Clint Eastwood walked into their meeting uninvited, dressed in faded jeans and a work shirt, carrying the kind of dangerous confidence that comes from someone who has already proven he doesn't need anyone's approval. He hadn't been invited to this gathering of establishment icons. But he had heard they were discussing the future of Western films, and he had decided it was time to make something very clear about whose future they were actually discussing. Didn't know this was open to the general public, Robert Mitchum said, his trademark drawl carrying just enough edge to make the insult clear while maintaining plausible deniability. He was referring to Clint's casual appearance in a room full of men wearing blazers and dress shirts. "It's not," John Wayne said, making direct eye contact with Clint for the first time. "This is a private discussion about preserving something important. Real American Westerns. The kind that built this industry. Clint crossed the soundstage floor with measured steps, stopping at a distance that was neither deferential nor aggressive. He didn't ask permission to stay. He simply stood there with the kind of absolute stillness that made everyone else's movements seem excessive by comparison. "Those Italian pictures you made," Richard Boone continued, speaking with the patronizing tone of an established professional addressing a lucky amateur. "They're entertaining, I'll give you that. But they're not real westerns. They're comic books with better cinematography. No heart, no values, just violence and style." Frank McCarthy nodded in agreement. The American Western has always been about something bigger than entertainment. It's about showing audiences what heroism looks like, what courage means, what it takes to build civilization from wilderness. He paused, looking directly at Clint. "What you're doing in those European productions? That's not heroism. That's just brutality with a marketing budget." Howard Hawks, who had remained silent until this point, finally spoke with the measured authority of someone who had directed more classic films than most people had watched. "The problem with your approach, son, is that you're confusing cynicism with sophistication. Real Western heroes have codes. They stand for something. Your characters? They are just survivors. That's not the same thing." Clint listened to all of this without changing expression. No defensive arguments. No justifications. No explanations. He just stood there, absorbing their criticisms with the kind of complete calm that started to make the five establishment figures wonder if he was listening at all, or if he simply didn't care about their opinions enough to respond to them. "You going to say something?" Wayne asked, his tone mixing curiosity with irritation. "Or did you just come here to observe the adults having a conversation?" "I came to demonstrate something," Clint said quietly. His voice was barely louder than conversational volume, which somehow made it more commanding than if he had shouted. "But I'll need your cooperation for about 4 minutes." The five men exchanged glances that mixed amusement with intrigue. Whatever this young upstart had in mind, it would at least be entertaining to watch him try. And if you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know what you think happens next. Also, tell us where you're watching from today. We love hearing from viewers around the world. 4 minutes for what exactly? Frank McCarthy asked, his producer's instincts immediately calculating whether this was worth their time or just going to be an embarrassing display they'd have to politely endure. Clint gestured toward the empty soundstage around them. "You're planning a tribute to classic westerns. Celebrating the traditional American hero. The clear moral codes, the obvious villains, the triumphant good guys." He paused, making eye contact with each man in sequence. "I want to demonstrate why that approach doesn't work anymore for modern audiences." "Doesn't work?" Richard Boone repeated, genuine offense creeping into his voice. "Son, that approach built everything you see around you. Every studio, every career, every dollar that flows through this industry exists because audiences believed in those heroes." Believed, Clint emphasized the past tense. Not believe. Not anymore. John Wayne stepped forward, his physical presence alone a reminder of why he had dominated screens for 4 decades. "All right. I'll play along. What's your demonstration?" Clint reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a scene from Stagecoach. Your breakthrough role. One of the greatest Western films ever made." He handed the paper to Wayne. "I want you to perform it exactly the way you did in 1939. Show us the traditional heroic approach. The clear morality, the confident delivery, the obvious courage." Wayne took the paper, immediately recognizing the scene. It was the moment when the Ringo Kid first reveals his code of honor to Dallas, explaining why he's willing to face dangerous men despite knowing he might die. It was a beautiful piece of writing, and Wayne had delivered it with the kind of earnest conviction that had made audiences fall in love with his screen persona. "And then what?" Wayne asked. "Then I'll perform the same scene," Clint said. "Using the approach that you gentlemen claim doesn't work. The minimalist, morally ambiguous, European-influenced style that you believe has no heart and no values." Howard Hawks smiled, recognizing an opportunity to prove his point. "And we'll judge which approach actually communicates the character's heroism more effectively." "Exactly," Clint confirmed. Robert Mitchum laughed, a deep rumbling sound that conveyed both amusement and certainty about the outcome. Kid, you're volunteering for a public education. That scene requires emotional range, vulnerable sincerity, and the ability to make audiences believe in genuine goodness. Your whole style is built on showing nothing, saying nothing, and hoping the audience projects depth onto emptiness. Maybe, Clint agreed. Let's find out. John Wayne studied the younger actor for a long moment, trying to understand what strategy could possibly be at work here. Clint had deliberately chosen a scene that played to every traditional strength that Wayne embodied and that the minimalist approach seemingly couldn't deliver. It was either supreme confidence or career-ending stupidity, and Wayne genuinely couldn't tell which. All right, Wayne said finally. I'll go first. Show you how it's supposed to be done. He stepped into the center of the soundstage, taking a moment to recall the emotional truth of the scene. When Wayne performed, he did it the same way he approached everything, with complete commitment to sincerity, with vocal clarity that reached the back of any theater, with physical presence that commanded attention, and with the kind of transparent emotional honesty that audiences had trusted for generations. The performance was magnificent. Wayne's voice carried conviction and vulnerability simultaneously. His physical presence communicated both strength and genuine tenderness. His eyes showed the internal conflict of a man who knew his code of honor might get him killed but couldn't imagine living without it. Every gesture supported the emotional truth of the moment. Every word landed with the weight of authentic human experience. When he finished, the four other establishment figures nodded with satisfaction. They had just witnessed exactly why John Wayne had dominated American cinema for decades. Technical mastery combined with emotional authenticity, delivered with the kind of unpretentious sincerity that made heroism feel achievable rather than distant. That's how you show an audience what honor means, Frank McCarthy said quietly. Not through tricks or style. Through genuine human truth. The five men turned their attention to Clint Eastwood, waiting to see how he would attempt to match what they had just witnessed. And what happened next would change everything they believed about acting, audiences, and the evolution of American storytelling. Clint stepped into the same space Wayne had just occupied. He didn't take a moment to prepare. He didn't warm up or settle into the emotional space of the scene. He simply stood there, completely still, and began speaking the same words Wayne had just delivered with such emotional power. But everything was different. His voice barely rose above conversational volume. No theatrical projection. No carefully modulated emotion. Just flat, quiet, almost casual delivery that sounded like he was telling someone the time rather than revealing his character's deepest values. His physical presence contracted instead of expanded. No commanding gestures. No vulnerable openness. Just controlled stillness that gave away absolutely nothing about what he was thinking or feeling. And then, halfway through the scene, he did something that made the five establishment figures physically lean forward. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. Just went completely silent for 3 full seconds. His eyes shifted slightly, looking past the imaginary person he was speaking to, as if he had suddenly remembered something painful that he had no intention of sharing. When he resumed speaking, his voice was even quieter than before, and the words came out with the kind of resigned certainty that suggested he knew his code of honor wouldn't save him but was going to follow it anyway because he had nothing else left to believe in. The final line, which Wayne had delivered with brave conviction, Clint spoke almost as a question. As if he wasn't quite sure he believed it himself but was choosing to act as if he did because the alternative was accepting that nothing meant anything. The performance lasted the same amount of time as Wayne's. The words were identical. But the emotional experience was completely, devastatingly different. When Clint finished, he stepped back and resumed his characteristic stillness, offering no explanation, no defense, no commentary on what he had just demonstrated. The silence in the soundstage stretched for 10 full seconds. The five establishment figures were struggling to process what they had experienced. Wayne's performance had shown them heroism as they understood it, clear, brave, emotionally transparent, and inspiring. Clint's performance had shown them something that terrified them, heroism that was uncertain, damaged, barely holding itself together, and somehow more authentic because of its fragility. That's not the same scene, Richard Boone said finally, his voice uncertain in a way that revealed how shaken he was. "It's every word you wrote," Clint replied quietly. "Same character. Same situation. Same moral choice. I just showed what it actually costs someone to maintain honor in a world that doesn't reward it." Howard Hawks leaned back, his expression unreadable. Frank McCarthy had gone completely still. Robert Mitchum was staring at Clint with something that looked like unwilling respect. And John Wayne's entire demeanor had changed. The confident superiority was gone. The dismissive certainty had vanished. He was looking at Clint Eastwood with the focused attention of someone who had just discovered he might have been wrong about something fundamental, and that realization was forcing him to rethink everything he believed about his craft and the industry he had dominated for 40 years. John Wayne crossed the soundstage slowly, stopping directly in front of Clint. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the authoritative dismissiveness that had characterized his earlier comments. "That was the most depressing piece of acting I've ever seen," Wayne said. He paused, and everyone waited for the criticism they expected to follow. "And I couldn't look away from it." Clint met his eyes with the same quiet intensity he had maintained throughout the entire encounter. He didn't respond, just waited to hear what Wayne would say next. "You didn't show heroism," Wayne continued, working through his thoughts in real time. "You showed what's left of someone who still chooses heroism after the world has beaten most of it out of them." He shook his head slowly. "That's not what I would have done with that scene. That's not what I believe audiences want to see." "But it's what they recognize," Clint said quietly. "Because that's what honor actually feels like to most people who try to maintain it. Not triumphant. Not clear. Just necessary." Wayne was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted into something none of the other men in the room had heard from him before: genuine curiosity without defensive judgment. "How did you figure that out?" Wayne asked. "That approach. That style. How did you know it would work?" "I didn't," Clint admitted. "I just knew the other way didn't feel true anymore. Not for the world we're living in now." Robert Mitchum spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "His not saying our way was wrong, Duke. His saying it was right for a different time. And times change." Wayne nodded slowly, still processing. The certainty that had defined his entire career was encountering something it couldn't dismiss or defeat, evidence that he might need to evolve his understanding of what American audiences needed from their heroes. And for a man who had built everything on knowing exactly who he was and what he represented, that realization was both humbling and transformative. Howard Hawks cleared his throat. "Well, this tribute event just got a lot more complicated. If this story is giving you a new perspective on these Hollywood legends, do us a favor and hit that like button. And drop a comment telling us which place you're watching this video from right now. We always love connecting with our audience around the world." "I'll be damned," Frank McCarthy said quietly, breaking the contemplative silence that had settled over the soundstage. "We just watched a changing of the guard happen in real time." The encounter that afternoon was never reported in Variety or The Hollywood Reporter. But the story spread through the industry in the way that truly significant moments always do, quietly, person to person, reshaping how people understood the evolution happening around them. John Wayne never publicly acknowledged that encounter. But those who worked with him in the years that followed noticed something had shifted. He stopped making dismissive comments about the new generation of actors. He defended Clint Eastwood in interviews, calling him a legitimate talent who understood something important about modern audiences. He even admitted in a 1974 conversation that the Western genre needed to evolve or die, and that younger filmmakers might understand that evolution better than his generation did. Clint Eastwood never mentioned the encounter either, which was perfectly consistent with everything about his approach to fame and respect. He simply continued building the career that would eventually make him one of the most respected figures in American cinema, proving through decades of work that his minimalist approach wasn't a temporary trend but a fundamental shift in how authentic emotion could be portrayed on screen. The lesson of that afternoon went far beyond acting techniques or generational conflicts. It was a reminder that true evolution happens when experience has the humility to recognize that wisdom can come from unexpected places. That respecting tradition doesn't require rejecting innovation. That the greatest artists are those who can acknowledge when the world has changed in ways that demand new approaches to timeless truths. And that sometimes the most important conversations happen not through argument but through demonstration, when someone shows rather than tells why the future requires different tools than the past. The cigarette smoke had long since cleared from that soundstage. The 5 establishment figures eventually left, each processing what they had witnessed in their own way. But something fundamental had shifted in Hollywood that afternoon. The old guard had encountered the future and, instead of dismissing it, had chosen to respect it. And John Wayne's tone, once so certain about who deserved recognition and why, had changed permanently because one quiet actor had demonstrated that strength could look different than tradition had taught them to recognize. Because when someone can show you a deeper truth using fewer words, less emotion, and quieter conviction than everything you've built your career on, you have 2 choices: dismiss them to protect your certainty, or respect them enough to question your assumptions. And on that March afternoon in 1971, John Wayne proved he was secure enough in his legacy to choose respect over certainty. Which might be the most heroic thing he ever did.